How often does journalism go meta?
Increasingly more so. I mean, you could argue my podcast is entirely meta, but
Yeah.
Yeah,
you'll also
which is
see like New York Times and Reuters and many places, like on the biggest stories, they'll have, a sidebar, the story about the story, or here's how we told this story. And yeah, I mean, supposedly people want more transparency about how this stuff is done, which kind of runs counter to the tradition where it used to be always like, you should make it about the subject and not about yourself. But it's interesting that to some degree, while people actually do want to know who is bringing them the news and how they're bringing the news, so they know if they can trust it or not. So yeah, it's been interesting to see things go in that direction. And I don't entirely know how I feel about it. I feel like my instincts are kind of to not, despite the podcast, my instincts are to keep myself out of my work. But is that the right instincts? I don't know.
yeah. I think it's also a tough position to take when the podcast is about introducing a person
You
every
hear?
week.
Yeah.
It's the idea that this is a person, it's a journalist, takes his or her job extremely seriously, and this is their life. You're putting it out there, so it's kind of
Right.
tough to not have to think about the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis, having access to hearing, listening, and then disseminating those kind of stories as well. No, it gets to that point also.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely do think about it. And, I think we are pretty transparent in our work to maybe to a fault. Reuters, like every sentence will be cited to something like, you will read a story and you will know exactly how we got it. And that can be frustrating to me if I'm, say, reading a newspaper and they just say something as a fact. I'm like, well, how do they know that? And I ask this as a journalist, of course, because I want to prove everything. But it's ridiculous of me to not think that a normal person might ask that question and like, that somehow I have a right to ask it, but they don't. So I think it is valid to want to know exactly and trace the path your news has taken to get to you.
Do you ever get flack for stuff that you say or hear on your podcast from your journalist friends?
No, I don't think I have. Like, certainly, my journalistic work, like I would say every journalist gets, trolls and things like that. But in terms of feedback on the podcast itself, I would say it's been overwhelmingly positive. I try to use it to be a booster of journalism. And I think, it's hard to hate on that. But
I like how he puts it. It's hard to hate on that.
but yeah, when I first started, I wasn't sure how people would react. I try not to get, it's not an opinion-y type thing, and like as Reuters is very, very neutral, and like even now, when I was talking about the job earlier, like I try to keep everything straight and factual, because you don't want to bias yourself, as it's called. You don't want to show bias that people, if you're later reporting on this or that, people say, but you said that 3 years ago, and this shows you were out to get us in the first place, that sort of thing. Like, so, I mean, it's most of the time, it doesn't veer that way. And that's why it's more of like telling the stories and things like that than debating, say, the big ideas in journalism today, yeah, Reuters is like, yeah, consistently like the most neutral, or like true neutral in Dungeons and Dragons, basically, or Switzerland, or whatever you want.
Switzerland is not very neutral. If you've seen what's that movie about the Wall Street?
Wolf of Wall Street?
Yeah. You see the scene where Leo DiCaprio figures out how to hide his money, and the French Swiss banker in front of him.
Yeah.
They're neutral to those that wish to access that neutrality by specific means. Let us put it that way.
Yeah.
So, Jake, do you have any questions for us?